episode 3 of Rogue Refinery. This is the Pioneer section. We're going to be chatting to David about what he got up to with Vadrok, Apex of Thunder. Just a reminder, if you haven't seen the standard section of this episode, be sure to go and check it out in the description down below. Welcome, David. How you doing, and how did Vadrok do for you in Pioneer?
I am doing well. Vadrok was an up and down kind of a card. You know, when we were discussing cards to play this week, Paul was like, if you guys think you can make it work in some of these non-rotating formats, I'm a little skeptical. And
He's like,
yeah, so I hate to admit when Paul is right, but of course, Pioneer is closer to a super standard than it is to a weaker modern. So, you know, Dan was having so much success in standard. I was thinking, all right, you know, there's at least more powerful spells that we can target with our Vadrok, so maybe it will port. But, you know, I ran into some issues.
Okay, issues like?
Well, I started on a token shell. So Paul was pretty eloquent, I think, in describing, you know, some of the tensions. And so I was trying to mitigate that. And the thought was we had better 1-drops. We get to play Legion's Landing. We get to play Toolcraft Exemplar. And then Vadrok targets are kind of upgraded a little bit. You get History of Benalia. That was a former standard all-star. Oh, yeah. And then Pride of Conquerors is kind of a pump spell. So you can, you know, get your pump spell if you need it. You can copy Raise the Alarm or Serval Expedition to add more tokens. You can get back a History of Benalia that's already buffed up your knights. So that was kind of the thought process.
So, I mean, that all makes a lot of sense. And even looking at this list here that we have, I mean, the list looks very, very solid to me. It looks like it's got a good mana curve. You know, it looks like your typical mono-white aggressive strategies that we've seen in the past, with kind of a slightly different thing to do in the end game, which is kind of mutate with Vadrok. How did this perform for you?
I went 2-3 with this list. And it was kind of a tale of two different matchups. When you play Urian type shells or shells that don't have cheap interaction, you really can run over your opponent. You know, you play your 1-drop, you play your Raise the Alarm on turn 2, you flip your Legion's Landing, and then you play your buff spell, whatever that may be. But Benelish Marshal, Regal Leosaur is a card from Ikoria. That card was very powerful. And you can kind of get underneath their Wrath effects. Against other aggro decks, though, they're just a lot faster than you, and you don't get to play that much interaction. So, I mean, I'm not telling tales out of school here. Lurrus is everywhere. Yep. It's one of the reasons that attracted me to the token shell is how much spot removal there is. People are playing spot removal to kill Lurrus and creatures in it, and the Lurrus shells themselves are playing tons of creatures. They're playing deadweights, right? And a deadweight is not that good against Raise the Alarm or Serval Expedition, but they're just so aggressive, and they can just kind of out-tempo you. Your cards are individually weak. Another problem is that Vadrok himself was probably the worst card in the deck. The nut draws of this deck are actually super powerful. I kill people, you know, on turn 4 very frequently. But Regal Leosaur is actually the mutate creature that's getting the job done. It's 1 mana cheaper. It adds a lot more power to the board. You can even play it as just the dummy 2/2 if you need to, although that's pretty bad. And the big hits that I thought I was going to get, you know, getting back History of Benalia, it's just such a tempo negative play. I mean, it's fine to kind of grind out that value, but the game is kind of already decided by the time you're doing stuff like that. So
yeah, I mean, it seems like what ends up happening is your deck ends up just slowing down a little too much. And it looks like you kind of try to do this kind of grindy mid-range thing, where it seems like the most success you'll actually have with this deck is trying to run your opponent over in the first 3 or 4 turns of the game.
Yeah, and I should point out again that Vadrok's mana cost is not easy to meet. It is red, in this case, white, and a colorless. So you have to play all these extra red sources, but you also want to play Benelish Marshal. That card is actually obscene. So I ended up doing a ton of damage myself. When you're trying to race, you know, Boros Lurrus or whatever, or the Boros Heroic Lurrus, or whatever flavor of Boros Lurrus, you know, you're playing Battlefield Forge, you're playing Sacred Foundry, and then I'm playing Spire of Industry to at least have kind of a way to cheat on casting Vadrok for real. And then you're playing Chefnet Dunes. So there were multiple times when I was playing Benelish Marshal doing 2 or 3 damage to myself. There were multiple times I had Vadrok in my hand and did not have 2 red sources. So yeah, the cost is very real. And like you say, Paul, the payoff is actually maybe making your deck worse at its A plan for the hope of this B plan. But the B plan is just so much weaker than every other deck sort of long game. You shouldn't plan to mitigate that. You're just going to lose those games. Being a little bit better in those situations is not worth it.
So basically what you're saying is take Vadrok out and you've got a pretty decent aggro deck, yeah?
Yeah, I think there's something here, especially if this is going to be, you know, Lurrus versus Urian. Regal Leosar really impressed me. I mean, you got 3 or 4 creatures in play, and you play it, and it's adding like 8 power to the board for 3 mana. It's haste. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So that card was sweet. But Vadrok, he might have to go back to the locker room and
think about what
showers.
he's done.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so this deck didn't end up performing the way that you wanted it to. Were there any other shells that you were, maybe hopefully finding some success with Vadrok?
Yeah, so I was still a little skittish because of all this removal. A lot of the shells I was trying out, you just play a creature and it dies, and so you're just staring at this Vadrok. And so, like Dan was saying, or like Dan said in the previous video, people should check out the standard video. If you're playing Vadrok at its normal rate, in standard that's already too weak. In Pioneer, I mean, it's a little embarrassing. So I wanted to make sure that I had a little bit more resistant to removal. So I kicked around the list, and I ended up in like a Temur shell that I kind of called like Temur hexproof.
Okay, how did that one do for you?
It also did not do very well. I went 1-4. The games you win are really sweet. You kind of get to do the thing. You get to play all these cards. It's super interactive. And then the games you lose, you just get run over. So you have lots of like 1-2 losses that, your 1 win was great, and your 2 losses, it just felt very dispiriting.
Okay, so, not the most inspiring of results, I'm sure, but let's chat about the deck anyway. So you spoke about having creatures that, stick around. So I'm looking at this Gladecover Scout, little hexproof friend. Is that the best option for Vadrok to mutate onto?
Yeah, so Gladecover Scout and Paradise Druid are cheap spells that are both the same color that have hexproof.
Mm-hmm.
Paradise Druid's text means that you'll get your mutate trigger, but once it attacks, it becomes vulnerable to removal from your opponent. Gladecover Scout does not have that problem, as you'll get your mutate if you want to cast Sea Dasher Octopus on turn 2, or later in the game, put your Vadrok on it. You know that it's going to be fine. It's not going to die to a shock. It's not going to die to a fatal push. One of the problems with this card is there are multiple Urian decks that are playing Trial of Ambitions. It gets around that. That means there's multiple decks in the format. You're tacking out your deck to fight all this removal. There's just main deck cards that people are playing 3 or 4 of that just kill your creature, and it's such a huge tempo loss if they we call an edict effect. If they make you sacrifice a creature, your only creature in play is often this scout because you mutated onto it instead of adding something else to the board. So it's just this built-in 2-for-1. So it was good at playing certain decks in terms of being resistant to that removal, but it opens you up for blowouts from other decks.
Yeah, it always feels bad getting 2-for-1. It's like, oh, look at my cute little monster I'm making, and then it's dead now.
Yeah, you're working so hard to do the thing, and then they're just like, nah, man, that's not what we're doing today.
Yeah, and I mean, not to mention, when you've seen other hexproof decks in the past, people usually look to Modern, right? Because you have kind of additional redundancy built in. You have the 4 copies of the Gladecover Scout along with the Slippery Bogle. Now, for you, did you run into that issue where you kind of had less consistency in being able to have something to kind of slap a mutate effect onto because you only had the 4 copies of Gladecover Scout, and with the Paradise Druid being kind of a little slower, not quite as explosive as what you could be doing in Modern?
Yeah, and then again, the mana rears its ugly head. You want early green to play your Gladecover Scout on curve, and then your requirement for Vadrok is red, red, blue. And the mana in Pioneer is good, but it's not perfect. The allied color, so red, green, Gruul, does not have a fast land. So we don't get to play, it's hard to play red, green lands in this deck that, help cast our Vadrok and cast our Gladecover Scout. We only have 4 Stomping Ground. I ran into that problem multiple times where I'd end up not being able to play my Gladecover Scout on 2, or I wouldn't be able to have 2 red sources for Vadrok.
I want to ask you now about Pollywog Symbiote. Is that good enough to be in this deck?
I'm not sure. The thought process was I wanted a creature that could survive shock effects. There's just Wild Slashes everywhere. This is a card that can block some early cards. It can block like a 1/2 haste on turn 1 of them. And then it just helps tear through your deck. When you're in the early game, Vadrok is very slow. It does not come down until turn 4. This accelerates that. It lets you play Vadrok on 3. In the late game, you want to get rid of all these lands and these less relevant cards. So Pollywog Symbiote starts ripping through your deck, trying to find other mutators. When once you've set up your sort of Vadrok mutate stack, all you want is another mutate creature. It's going to trigger, a Gem Razor. It's going to trigger your Vadrok, another Vadrok on your Vadrok. I will say the loot effect, when we say loot, we mean draw and discard, is not a may. So there were multiple times where I just got blown out by Narset. Like if you have Pollywog Symbiote in play, there was a time when Narset and Teferi were both in play. I was going to Vadrok onto Pollywog Symbiote, get my shock, like kill their Teferi, and then attack and kill Narset. Instead, I headed to the only card in hand. I was like, oh, I didn't get to draw, and it was a must. There's nothing I could do. And then Vadrok gets stopped by Teferi. So it was just like, man, what is going on here? I just canceled that game. I didn't send in any footage. That's buried in Al Capone's vault. No one's ever going to see that. But that's something you learn the hard way. You're not aware of some of these crazy interactions. Yeah.
Okay, so we've seen a lot of, I guess, fail case scenarios, disruption, just all kinds of different ways to lose. Now, for, I guess, your one win, what was it that happened that, actually made it so that you got the pieces together to actually kind of pick up some victories with this deck? Yeah,
so I kind of got to do the thing. I was playing a Jeskai Ascendancy list, which is one of the few lists in Pioneer that's joining me in choosing to not play a companion. And I just set up this sweet loop where I was playing Vadrok and Sea Dasher Octopus and looting through my deck, and every turn they were just drawing the same Jeskai Ascendancy over and over again. And I was just Aether Gusting it back to the top of their deck. So I did it like 3 or 4 or 5 times at the end until I found Cinder Vines that just did enough damage to them. They couldn't win the game. So it was just super sweet. I mean, when you draw it up in your mind, that's what you're expecting to happen, is this huge mutate stack, and it's all on creatures that are immune to removal, and you're getting in there with your Sea Dasher Octopus. You're just drawing a card or two a turn, plus you're looting with Pollywog Symbiote. But that's few and far between, because the Jeskai Ascendancy list is just one of the few lists that's not playing a lot of interaction. And people are coming prepared for Lurrus, and cards that are good against Lurrus are good against what you're doing. So, normally when you play a card that's off the beaten path, like Dan's describing, you kind of take people by surprise. Oh, they're not playing a lot of cheap removal. These Fires lists are kind of playing this battle cruiser style Magic. Well, any card you pack that is actually powerful against Lurrus is probably going to be good against this. We talked about Teferi. Ash Zealot is another card. Every time Vadrok triggers, Ash Zealot does 3 damage to you. That's a card that they don't have anti-Vadrok tech. That is a good card against Lurrus. People are main decking Soul Guide Lantern. The Lurrus Abzan Rally list is playing like a Dranith Magistrate that they can tutor up with their Fiend Artisan. That also stops Vadrok. Your deck plan is kind of cute, and maybe in a different world to be a little more effective. But the fact that it also is kind of doing the same kind of things that Lurrus is doing means you're catching a lot of splash damage. So, analogy we might draw, Paul, is like in Modern, you're playing a cool artifact deck, but it's like people are already bringing Hate for Affinity. So you're losing the Stony Silences. They're not packing to beat your weird, brew. They're playing there's a tier 1 deck that they're targeting, and it also happens to hit you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be kind of the biggest problem with, I guess, this shell just overall, right? Where oftentimes when you want to build a cool off-the-wall deck, it has to be kind of timed correctly. And it all just depends on what the current state of the metagame is. And right now, in Pioneer, it's basically just dominated by Lurrus and people trying to beat Lurrus. And in that world, bringing another cheap creature deck and trying to build something up probably just isn't the best way to go about it. And not to mention, the Lurrus deck is a well-oiled machine, very, very efficient package. Oh, yeah. That's probably just a better deck to play if you want to be playing those small creatures anywho. And so, I mean, it seems like the challenge of building around Vadrok, at least in Pioneer, I mean, there just seems to be too many things to try and overcome to have this deck be successful.
I would agree with all that, except for I would delete the word "probably better deck," and I would just. I think everything you said is exactly correct.
I'm just trying to frame it so maybe somebody else gives it a shot. All right.
Only assist speaks in absolutes, but I'm pretty comfortable with that assessment.
Fair enough.
Well, a good attempt nonetheless. I think Paul hit the nail on the head when he said that Standard and Vadrok are probably better friends at the moment than Pioneer is with it, but. We try, we live, we learn. That's the whole point of the show. It's to refine and try and make the best deck for the cards that we pick each week. So thank you very much, David. Much appreciated, and we'll see you a little later.
Thanks for having me.
That's going to do it for the Pioneer section of episode 3 of Rogue Refinery. We're going to be catching up with Damon next in the Modern section, so be sure to go and click the link down below in the description, or clicky the linky, which should be showing up around here somewhere. Also, if you haven't seen the Standard section of this episode, be sure to go and check that out too. And as always, leave a like, subscribe, comment, click the bell, do all those things, feed that algorithm for us, and we'll see you again very, very soon.